Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Prelude to War's Tensions Rise in the Middle East. Welcome to the first chapter of the Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East. In this chapter, we'll explore the complex web of tensions, events, and factors that led up to the outbreak of one of the most significant conflicts in the history of the region. After the end of the Six-Day War in 1967, the Middle East was left with a fragile peace. Israel had emerged as the dominant military power in the region, occupying large swathes of Arab territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. This situation created deep resentment and anger among the Arab populations, who saw Israel as an occupier and a colonial power. One of the key factors that contributed to the tensions in the region was the rise of Palestinian nationalism. Since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, when Israel was first established, there had been a growing movement among Palestinians to establish their own state. This movement gained momentum after the Six-Day War, when Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which had previously been under Jordanian and Egyptian control, respectively. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, was the main political and military organization advocating for Palestinian rights. Led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO carried out a series of attacks against Israeli targets, including bombings, hijackings, and shootings, in an attempt to force Israel to withdraw from Palestinian territories. In addition to the Palestinian issue, there were other factors that contributed to the rising tensions in the region. One of the most significant was the ongoing conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, particularly Egypt and Syria. Both countries had been humiliated by their defeat in the Six-Day War and were eager to regain their lost territories and restore their honor. Egypt, in particular, had a lot to gain from a conflict with Israel. The country was facing a serious economic crisis, with high inflation, high unemployment, and a growing population. President Anwar Sadat believed that a military victory over Israel would not only restore Egypt's pride but also bring economic and political benefits to the country. Another important factor was the role of the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, in the region. Both countries had a strategic interest in the Middle East, and each supported different sides in the conflict. The United States provided military and economic aid to Israel, while the Soviet Union supported Arab countries, such as Syria and Egypt. The tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors escalated throughout the early 1970s. In 1970, Jordan expelled the PLO from its territory, leading to a violent conflict between Jordanian and Palestinian forces. In 1972, Palestinian militants carried out the Munich Olympics massacre, in which 11 Israeli athletes were killed. In response, Israel carried out a series of retaliatory attacks against PLO targets. All of these factors contributed to the growing sense of tension and instability in the region. By the autumn of 1973, the stage was set for a new conflict. In the next chapter, we'll examine the opening salvoes of the war and the surprise attack that caught Israel off guard. Chapter 2, Surprise Attack, the opening salvoes of the war. Welcome to the second chapter of the Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East. In this chapter, we'll explore the events of the first few days of the war, which began with a surprise attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces on Israeli positions on the Yom Kippur holiday. On October 6, 1973, at approximately 2 p.m., Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack on Israeli positions in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The attack came as a complete surprise to Israeli forces, who had not anticipated an attack on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The Egyptian attack began with a massive artillery barrage along the Suez Canal, followed by a crossing of the canal by Egyptian forces. The Syrian attack on the Golan Heights was also preceded by heavy artillery fire, followed by a ground assault. The Israeli defense forces were caught off guard and initially struggled to respond to the surprise attack. Despite the initial shock of the attack, Israeli forces soon began to rally and put up a fierce defense. In the Sinai, Israeli forces launched a counterattack and managed to repel the Egyptian forces, who had made significant gains in the early hours of the conflict. In the Golan Heights, Israeli forces were initially pushed back by the Syrian army, who made gains in the early days of the conflict. One of the most significant aspects of the opening salvos of the war was the role of technology. The Israeli military had long prided itself on its superior technology and military prowess, but in the early days of the conflict, it became clear that the Egyptian and Syrian forces had made significant advancements in their military capabilities. The Egyptian forces, in particular, had acquired advanced Soviet-made anti-tank missiles, which proved devastating against Israeli tanks. As the first few days of the conflict played out, it became clear that the war was going to be a much more difficult and protracted affair than anyone had anticipated. Israeli forces had been caught off guard by the surprise attack and were struggling to respond to the combined Egyptian and Syrian onslaught. In the next chapter, we'll take a closer look at the battle for the Sinai and Israel's successful counterattack, which helped to turn the tide of the conflict. Chapter 3: The Battle for the Sinai, Israel's Counterattack. Welcome to the third chapter of the Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East. In this chapter, we'll explore the Israeli counterattack in the Sinai Peninsula, which helped to turn the tide of the conflict. After the initial surprise attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces, the Israeli military quickly mobilized its reserve forces and began to mount a counterattack in the Sinai. The Israeli forces were led by General Ariel Sharon, who had a reputation as a skilled military strategist and a master of mobile warfare. The Israeli counterattack was swift and decisive. Israeli forces began to push back the Egyptian army, retaking the territory that had been lost in the early hours of the conflict. Israeli tanks, supported by infantry and air power, swept through the Sinai, inflicting heavy casualties on the Egyptian forces and destroying their military infrastructure. One of the key factors in Israel's success in the Sinai was its use of mobile tactics. Israeli forces were able to move quickly and decisively, striking at key targets and avoiding the static defenses of the Egyptian army. The Israeli Air Force also played a crucial role, providing close air support to ground forces and attacking Egyptian positions from the air. The Battle of the Chinese Farm, which took place on October 14th to 15th, was one of the most significant engagements of the conflict. Israeli forces launched a surprise attack on a heavily fortified Egyptian position near the Suez Canal, using a combination of infantry, tanks, and air power to overcome the Egyptian defenses. The battle was a major victory for the Israeli forces, who were able to break through the Egyptian lines and establish a foothold on the western bank of the canal. As the Israeli counterattack in the Sinai gained momentum, the Egyptian army began to retreat, abandoning its defensive positions and falling back towards the Suez Canal. Israeli forces pursued the retreating Egyptian army, inflicting heavy casualties and taking thousands of prisoners. By the end of October, the Israeli counterattack in the Sinai had succeeded in pushing the Egyptian army back across the Suez Canal and establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the canal. The Israeli military had demonstrated its superior technology, tactics, and leadership, and had succeeded in turning the tide of the conflict. In the next chapter, we'll take a closer look at the war in the Golan Heights and the difficult battles that took place between Israeli and Syrian forces. Chapter 4: The War in the Golan Heights, a stalemate in the north. Welcome to the fourth chapter of the Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East. In this chapter, we'll explore the difficult and protracted battles that took place between Israeli and Syrian forces in the Golan Heights. Unlike the swift and decisive counterattack in the Sinai, the war in the Golan Heights was a much more difficult and protracted affair. The terrain in the Golan Heights was rugged and mountainous, with steep cliffs and deep valleys. This made it a challenging environment for military operations, particularly for armored forces. The Syrian army had heavily fortified its positions in the Golan Heights, building a network of bunkers, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles. The Israeli military, on the other hand, had not anticipated a major attack in the north and had left its defenses in the area relatively weak. The initial Syrian attack on the Golan Heights was a success, with Syrian forces making significant gains in the early days of the conflict. The Israeli military was caught off guard by the surprise attack and struggled to respond to the Syrian assault. Despite the early successes of the Syrian army, the Israeli military began to mount a counterattack in the Golan Heights, using a combination of infantry, tanks, and air power. The battles that followed were some of the most intense and brutal of the conflict, with both sides suffering heavy losses. One of the most significant battles of the conflict was the Battle of Tel Saki, which took place on October 11th. Israeli forces launched a surprise attack on a heavily fortified Syrian position, using a combination of tanks and infantry to overcome the Syrian defenses. The battle was a major victory for the Israeli forces, who were able to establish a foothold in Syrian territory. Despite this success, the war in the Golan Heights remained a stalemate. The Syrian army was able to hold its ground and repel Israeli advances, inflicting heavy losses on the Israeli military. The Israeli military, for its part, struggled to dislodge the Syrian army from its fortified positions and suffered from a shortage of ammunition and other supplies. As the conflict in the Golan Heights continued, both sides began to feel the strain of the prolonged fighting. The Syrian army, in particular, was suffering from a shortage of supplies and was struggling to maintain its front lines. The Israeli military, on the other hand, was facing mounting pressure from the international community to bring the conflict to an end. In the next chapter, we'll examine the diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire and end the conflict, and the impact of the war on the Middle East and the wider world. Chapter 5, Diplomacy and Aftermath, the End of the War and Its Legacy. Welcome to the final chapter of the Yom Kippur War, the conflict that shook the Middle East. In this chapter, we'll explore the diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire and end the conflict, and the impact of the war on the Middle East and the wider world. As the war in the Sinai and the Golan Heights continued, the international community began to put pressure on the warring parties to bring the conflict to an end. The United States, in particular, played a key role in the diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire. On October 22, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 338, which called for an immediate ceasefire and the beginning of negotiations for a lasting peace settlement. The resolution was accepted by both Israel and Egypt, and a ceasefire went into effect on October 25. A separate ceasefire agreement was reached with Syria on October 30. The end of the war marked a significant turning point in the history of the Middle East. While the conflict had not resulted in a clear victory for either side, it had demonstrated the limits of military power and the need for a diplomatic solution to the long-standing issues that had fueled the conflict. The war also had significant consequences for the wider world. It marked a shift in the balance of power in the region, with the rise of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states as major players in the Middle East. It also had a profound impact on the global oil market, as Arab countries used their oil reserves as a political weapon in the aftermath of the conflict. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Yom Kippur War, however, was its impact on the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war had demonstrated the strength and resilience of Palestinian nationalism and had exposed the weakness of Israeli military power in the face of determined resistance. It also served as a catalyst for the rise of Palestinian militant groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which would go on to play a significant role in the decades-long conflict. In the aftermath of the war, a series of peace negotiations were held between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt in 1978, and the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1993. While these efforts have yet to bring about a lasting peace settlement in the region, they represent a recognition of the need for dialogue and compromise in resolving the long-standing issues that have fueled the conflict. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the Yom Kippur War. We hope that this book has provided you with a deeper understanding of this complex and fascinating conflict and its lasting impact on the Middle East and the wider world. Thank you for reading. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.